did 9 o'clock news with Martin Lowe.
Iraqi Scud missile attacks hit both Israel and Saudi Arabia tonight. The Saudi capital, Riyadh, suffers its first serious damage of the war. Israel reports 1 person killed, 40 slightly injured, as the Patriots allow at least 1 missile through. America accuses Iraq of environmental terrorism, deliberately creating an oil disaster in the Gulf. The commander of the British forces says, "We are winning and will go on winning." Baghdad television shows pictures of civilian areas it claims were hit by Allied bombing. Good evening. Iraqi Scud missiles got through to hit the Israeli city of Tel Aviv and the capital Riyadh tonight. The attack on Riyadh appears to have demolished a building. There are no reports yet of any casualties. The attack on Israel, the 5th in 6 days, has killed 1 person and slightly injured 40 more. Today's other developments on the war front. The Chief of Defence Staff, Sir David Craig, gives a confident account of the war. It's got off to a good start. Allied superiority is sustained without difficulty, he says. The British commander in the Gulf, Lieutenant General Sir Peter de la Billière, says low-level flying raids are suspended. Different air tactics may now be used. The Iraqi Air Force is too frightened to fight, he says. A report from Moscow says the Iraqi president had his top Air Force commanders executed after the first days of the war. And Washington says millions of barrels of oil are being pumped into the Gulf by Iraq to hamper Allied naval attacks. The huge oil slick could be the world's worst environmental disaster, warns the White House. Tonight's Scud attack on the Saudi capital Riyadh is the 4th since the war in the Gulf started, but the first to succeed in hitting the city. Reports say 2 missiles were launched. Patriot anti-missile missiles were launched in defense, but only stopped 1 of the Scuds.
The Patriot was fired to intercept 1 of the Scuds, and it did its job. But the second Scud got through, speeding through the sky like a comet and plunging into the city with a thunderous explosion. This was the result, a government building in Riyadh, part of which was completely destroyed. I saw at least 1 person seriously injured lying on a stretcher, and there were reports that someone else was trapped inside the building that had collapsed. Riyadh has been a target not only because it's the capital of Saudi Arabia and home to the royal family, but also because it's here that the Allied commanders have their headquarters. Those commanders must now redouble their efforts to find the remaining Scud missile launchers in Iraq and Kuwait. The building that was destroyed in this attack is right next to a hospital in the city, but it's thought no one there was injured. The only good news here tonight is that no chemicals or nerve agents were on board the missile.
The site is clear of all chemicals. Over.
Nevertheless, Hussein will no doubt be delighted that he's finally managed to penetrate the elaborate anti-Scud defences in Saudi Arabia, and that he's struck deep into the country from where the Allies have launched Operation Desert Storm. We understand the building that was hit here tonight belonged to the Ministry of Interior, but we're not allowed to say exactly where in the city it is.
Until now, Riyadh's Patriot missile defences have been entirely successful, knocking all incoming Scuds out of the sky. One of the men who operate those Patriots said that this city is the safest place on earth. Tonight, though, Riyadh's luck has run out. Ben Brown, BBC News, Riyadh.
Well, joining me now from Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, is our correspondent, Ben Brown. Ben, any more details on that explosion?
Well, there are conflicting reports tonight, Martin, about exactly what happened. We think there were either 2 or 3 Scud missiles that were fired at the capital. We're not absolutely certain, but one of them certainly did get through. What seems to have happened is the Scud flew across the sky, and a Patriot tried to chase it, but it couldn't catch up with that Scud, and it then crashed into this building, which I said was an Interior Ministry building. We're not allowed to say exactly where it is, but there's a scene of complete chaos and confusion down there at the moment. I've just come back. There are dozens and dozens of ambulances, police cars, fire engines. No one is absolutely certain if there have been casualties or not. We've had one unconfirmed report that somebody has died. That, as I say, is unconfirmed, but certainly I did see somebody lying on a stretcher looking very seriously ill indeed. We don't know whether there were people inside the building at the time. Because it was a government building, we assume it was empty at this time of night, but we're not certain.
Ben, the Patriots have been very successful in Riyadh so far. Why do you think they failed on this occasion, or is it too early to say?
I think it is too early to say. As you say, they've been completely successful. All the Scuds that have been fired here have either been knocked out of the sky or they've been deliberately allowed to go on because they were heading to miss the city, miss the population area here and head into the desert. So they've been allowed to go on. There are a large number of missile batteries here. Again, we're not allowed to say how many, and until now they've been successful. There will obviously be a full and very thorough investigation by the American military here who man those Patriot batteries.
But are these persistent Scud attacks a growing worry in Riyadh?
Well, I think they are. General Schwarzkopf the other day was making light of them, saying it was more dangerous to stand in a thunderstorm in Georgia than it was to stand in the middle of Riyadh when the Scuds are coming in. I think now he's going to be regretting those words.
Are there any more words on how successful the Allies have been in targeting the sites from which the Scud missiles are launched?
Well, they've said again tonight at an American military briefing here that the remaining mobile Scud missile launches are still very much a priority. The worry for the Americans and for the Allies in their bombing campaign is that this search for the Scuds is distracting them from other key military targets. Until now, certainly here in Riyadh, they've simply seen these Scuds as a weapon of terror that is not of military significance. And they haven't, General Schwarzkopf certainly has, as I said, rather made light of these Scud attacks. But I think they're going to have to redouble their efforts to find the mobile launchers. They're not easy to find. They're very small. They're the size of a truck, these mobile launchers. They can come in, come out, and go back in again in the middle of the night under cover of darkness. And they're not easy to find or attack.
Ben Brown in Riyadh, thank you very much indeed. Of the 7 Iraqi rockets fired at Israel tonight, several were shot down by the US-supplied Patriot missiles. The raids caused extensive damage in Tel Aviv and the northern city of Haifa, where lines of cars were set ablaze.
American Patriot missiles streamed across the skies over Tel Aviv. The Israeli Defense Forces say 7 of them did intercept incoming Scuds. But at least one fell short of its target. And Saddam Hussein succeeded in hitting Israeli soil with devastating effect. One residential block was utterly destroyed, a direct hit that flattened dozens of homes. Many Israelis were beginning their celebrations for the Jewish Sabbath. There was just time to get into sealed rooms prepared against chemical attack when the Scuds began to fall.
The first explosion, we heard a boom, a little boom, and then the second and the third, my mother and father, they fell on the floor because of and all the windows broke down on us in the room. It was so we were so frightened, all of us.
Dozens of buildings were badly damaged. A series of impacts blew out windows and doors.
We heard a few booms, and we sat on the special room that we prepared, but it just all went in, all the glasses, and the door moved. My father, he wanted to close the door, and the door just went on.
The streets were littered with burning cars. For a time, there was some confusion. We were caught in the midst of the attack ourselves. There was a loud thud alarmingly close to our car as we headed for shelter. Clearly, after the briefest of lulls, Tel Aviv has come under attack again. Chemical experts were quickly deployed in full protective clothing, testing for any trace of gas. So far, there's no indication anything other than conventional weapons were used. But this is by far the most concerted and serious Iraqi attack so far on the civilian population of Israel. At least 40 casualties were reported within the first hour. The damage can be seen at many locations in the city. We cannot be more specific. But more than one residential area was hit. The people here, though obviously shocked, are somewhat defiant.
And I have the bomb. After then, I come to the garden here. I see the motor of the rocket.
He's not going to break us. We're going to stay here. We're going to live here. He's far there. Nothing is going to happen. We're not going to live. We didn't leave before. We knew that there is a danger. But this is my house. I'm going to stay here. And he can try, but he's not going to break us.
And there is anger as well. This attack is certain to increase pressure for retaliation against Saddam Hussein. Carol Walker, BBC News, Tel Aviv.
Tonight's was the 5th attack on Israel in 6 days. There has been international condemnation of the attacks, coupled with pressure on the Israelis not to retaliate.
Israel has always vowed that Jews would never again be on the receiving end of this sort of punishment. Its policy of non-retaliation, retained up until this, the 5th missile attack in a week, will now be reviewed, but most likely it will not be changed. Israel's cabinet is divided over the issue of striking back. It has been convened practically every day this week, and no doubt it will meet again tomorrow evening when the Jewish Shabbat is over. But while Israel's defense is paramount, so are the interests of the United States, and so is the rapidly changing perception of Israel abroad. Following the first 2 missile attacks, the Americans sent Patriot missile batteries. These anti-missile missiles had been seen in action in Saudi Arabia, and they'd worked. Now US personnel were sent here to operate them, and the US Deputy Secretary of State, Mr. Eagleberger, who arrived in Israel to urge restraint, supervised it all. This was the result of the first interception. The incoming Scud missile had been hit, but its warhead wasn't damaged. It landed on an apartment block in Tel Aviv, killing 3 people and injuring more than 100. The night after, however, Patriot missiles successfully destroyed a Scud which was aimed at Haifa. Israel's finance minister put a price on his country's patience when he met Mr. Eagleberger and suggested the United States pay $13 billion to Israel to, among other things, help compensate for the effects of the war. The signs are that the Americans will pay up without question. What has complicated the entry of Israel's Air Force into this conflict to launch any air attack on Iraq is that it would have to do so with the full cooperation of the Americans. Otherwise, its planes could easily be mistaken for enemy targets. Mr. Eagleberger attempted to resolve it. He wanted all Israel's plans, but left with only an assurance that America would be kept fully informed about Israeli intentions. To a race which has always believed itself to be under siege from the Arab world, these pictures confirm the worst of its fears. But the Israelis recognize the remarkable turnaround in international opinion towards them, as the often perceived aggressor towards Palestinians, for instance, becomes the victim of hostile Iraq. Germany's Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher saw the Tel Aviv damage for himself, and the European community announced the lifting of a ban on scientific cooperation with Israel. For the moment, then, the political benefit of firing off defensive Patriot missiles outweighs any thoughts of military reprisal. But Israel's patience and its public opinion won't stand attacks like this forever.
Well, joining me now from Jerusalem is the Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, Reuben Merhav. Mr. Merhav, your government has shown restraint so far. Are you likely to be able to hold back the hawks in your cabinet after this 5th Scud attack?
Well, this is a good evening from Jerusalem. There is no question of hawks in the cabinet. I think the government and the electorate and the people of Israel are solidly united behind the present policy. The question is, of course, when and how, not to retaliate, but to exercise the basic right of self-defense. This has been made very clearly both by our ministers and other representatives of the public, and it will be done when time is ripe. For the time being, the policy is that of restraint. It may probably be reiterated in the cabinet meeting on Sunday, But I don't think that this can go on for much longer. It is for us to choose the right mode and the right time to respond and to exercise the right of self-defense.
But how much is the Israeli cabinet influenced by the plaudits you appear to be winning around the world for your continuing restraint in the face of Iraqi provocation?
I don't think this is really the question.
Well, it's the question I'm asking you.
Yeah, but this is not, but let me try and dwell on it a bit. It is not the question of the sympathy, it's a question of basic understanding, which we have been lacking for years and years. Because for a long time now we have been stressing very clearly and very loudly that we are surrounded by countries which are dictatorships or totalitarian or authoritarian. And it is very difficult to maintain a working and thriving democracy amidst such an ocean, where decisions are taken between the ears of one dictator or one authoritarian ruler, which has been precisely the case with Iraq, which we have been propagating and telling our friends and foes alike for a year and a half now. Now, it is for us to take the decisions, it is for us to defend ourselves. Israel has always defended its own population, and for the first time in a history of over 42 years, it is in a position where its hands are, so to say, half-cuffed.
Very briefly, are you satisfied with the way that the Patriot anti-missile system is working?
Well, it is a great improvement, and the deployment of further batteries of the Patriot type is definitely going to enhance our security. At the same time, let me tell you that maintaining a thriving democracy under the siege towards which you cannot reply is a very, very difficult task, and I am sure we shall prevail.
Mr. Merhav, thank you for joining us.
Good night and thank you.
Well, President Bush has strongly attacked the Iraqi president, not just for the latest attack on Israel, but for causing the oil slick off the coast of Kuwait. He said Saddam Hussein would gain no military advantage from what he called this act of environmental terrorism. The Pentagon said that the huge oil slick, which is now 15 kilometers long. Allied military officials believe it has come from Kuwait's main offshore oil tanker loading point at Mina al-Ahmadi. They say Iraq is deliberately pumping millions of barrels of oil into the sea to hamper their landing attacks.
Oil lapping ashore on the Saudi Arabian coastline, the edge of a slick already nearly 10 miles long and believed to be still flowing from an offshore pump opened deliberately by the Iraqis, now floating south from Kuwait. The pump can produce 100,000 barrels a day. President Bush says Saddam Hussein continues to amaze the world.
And now he resorts to enormous environmental damage but in terms of turning loose a lot of oil. No military advantage to him whatsoever in this. It's not going to help him at all, absolutely not.
The Pentagon calls it environmental terrorism, although the Iraqis say the slick came from 2 tankers bombed by the Americans.
I would not speculate, but that's an awful lot of oil to pump in there accidentally. It seems to track with the fact that some of the oil locations have been burning for several days in Kuwait. And again, I think until we have all the facts, it would be speculative, but it certainly is curious that it's pumping out that much fuel. And unfortunately, it's in enemy territory. It's not so easy to just go and turn off the pump and stop it from flowing.
Fires continue to burn from Kuwaiti oil fields deliberately set alight by the Iraqis earlier this week, hampering visibility for Allied bombers. If the oil slick is set alight during an assault on Kuwait, American commanders say they can work around it. For the moment, the oil slick has no military use, but is an ecological disaster, probably bigger than the Exxon Valdez spillage off Alaska.
President Bush has also said Saddam Hussein is continuing to amaze the world with his brutality. And as we said, he strongly condemned the latest Scud attacks on Israel. Gavin Esler reports now from Washington.
Just a few months ago, the Bush administration publicly chastised Israel for not being sufficiently serious about Middle East peace. But every Scud that falls has cemented the U.S.-Israeli relationship as never before. This was today's installment.
We condemn this brutal act. The Secretary of State again expresses his sorrow over these unprovoked attacks and his deep appreciation for Israeli restraint again today. We are adding more Patriot units to defend against these attacks. These Patriot units will be coming out of Europe, and they will have American crews. As you all know, the United States is making every effort to destroy these Scuds.
More Patriots for Israel, more attacks by Iraq, but a broadly upbeat message as the president, sitting with a group of Arab Americans, tried to even out the conflicting optimistic and pessimistic noises confusing the American public about this war.
I know that maybe some divisions of one kind or another, that's fine, but it is going well, and I'm more determined than ever to bring this to a successful conclusion. The coalition is working very well, holding together with great strength, great conviction.
With diplomacy silenced by gunfire, Secretary of State Baker met the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. to discuss who pays how much for the war. The Kuwaitis offered a further $13.5 billion.
We believe this is a small and insignificant contribution to the contribution that our friends in the United States have made, not just in financial, but in human resources and financial resources that they have put into this operation, which we are deeply indebted to.
Within the past hour, at a White House news conference, Mr. Bush returned to his condemnation of the Scud attacks.
We want to find ways to stop these brutal, senseless, non-military value attacks on civilian populations.
Mr. Bush was asked why he was still sticking to his normal routine, including his planned State of the Union address next week.
I am not going to be held a captive in the White House by Saddam Hussein of Iraq. And you can make a note of that one. We're going about our business.
But there was one hint of bad news. Tomorrow, Secretary of State Baker will meet his Soviet counterpart and possibly postpone next month's Moscow summit. A casualty not of the Gulf, but the crackdown in the Baltic states.
The problems in the Baltic states, the use of force there, causes us great difficulty. And so the Besmertnik-Baker talks will touch on a wide array of issues. Some where we have very much common ground, some where we have common objectives that are not fulfilled, and some where we might have clear differences.
The air of business as usual means the Bush family will again spend the weekend at their Camp David retreat. War as usual means they will undoubtedly be joined by the president's top national security advisors. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Washington.
The commander of the British forces in the Gulf, Sir Peter de la Billière, has said the Allies are winning the war and will continue to win, despite possible setbacks to come. The Chief of Staff of US forces in the Gulf echoed this cautious optimism and said the focus of the Allied campaign was still to attack Iraq's Republican Guard and Scud missile sites.
In his first public appearance since the war began, General Sir Peter de la Billière, formerly of the SAS, now a British commander in the Gulf, emerged to give a confident assessment of the Allied campaign and of its impact on the Iraqi military.
We've seen his air force, too frightened to fight, condemned to its bunkers, being picked off one by one by the air forces. We're watching his army being degraded in front of our eyes, lost communications with the senior headquarters, tied to holes in the desert, unable to withdraw, unable to surrender because their leader won't let them and because they've got Republican Guard behind and minefields in front, which tie them to their present positions.
It's a campaign centered on precision bombing, and though Sir Peter admitted he'd been skeptical of American claims about their weapons, he was totally converted to them now. But detail of the extent of the damage inflicted by the bombing still isn't forthcoming, and probably won't be in case it helps Iraq. Instead, only a general impression is available. The raids by giant B-52 bombers, in action for the first time since Vietnam, have, according to American pilots, left clear marks on Iraqi positions in Kuwait. And in London this morning, the Chief of Defence Staff described their effect.
The psychological impact, the wearing down, no sleep, no moment to sort of relax. That's the sort of thing, on top of the physical damage done to equipment and to tanks and artillery and the reduction of ammunition and fuel supply and stores, all of that really gets to you.
The Allied hope is that the bombing may force widespread desertions or high-level mutiny or at least make a ground offensive easier. Whichever, the message today was of optimism and staying power.
We're winning, and we're going to go on winning, and we may take some setbacks, and we're in a position where we can afford to take those setbacks, come through them out the other side, and still win.
And with that, on Burns Night came a display of confidence at British headquarters. For the veteran of countless, mostly secret wars, it was a chance to have a short break from the management of a much more public one.
General de la Billière also praised the bravery of the RAF in what he called a cauldron of battle. Sir Peter said the low-level bombing raids by RAF Tornadoes had been stopped for the time being, but he stressed that when the tactic was needed again, it would be used again. And at a briefing in the Gulf, a senior RAF officer said he was sick of people criticising missions by Tornado aircraft. Group Captain David Henderson said, "We have been very effective out here and will carry on being effective."
Another Tornado mission ends in the early hours of this morning. 5 of the RAF's aircraft have been destroyed in combat. Last night, it nearly became 6. The crew concerned wants to preserve its anonymity.
When that actually happened, it was just, what the hell was that? And get on with what we were doing, sort of thing.
From that point on, the aircraft started to tumble, and it rolled sort of almost into the upside-down position and started coming down towards the ground. We were both heads out of the cockpit, looking to see what damage had been done to the aircraft and to see if there was any more incoming missiles, which there were. We saw about half a dozen coming towards us, and basically just flew the aeroplane trying to avoid them as best they could.
Daylight revealed the extent of the damage to their aircraft. There was more talk today of changes in tactics to cut losses, but this crew remains convinced of the Tornado's quality.
I was quite pleased that the aircraft had withstood so much damage. To be honest, I didn't expect it to be able to take that much, but it seemed to be quite survivable.
Some people have blamed the losses on the Air Force's JP-233 runway attack bomb. Today, aircraft were being loaded with different weapons, but the Ministry of Defence insists that only one aircraft which was lost was carrying the JP-233. Criticism of Tornado on American television prompted a swift response from one Tornado station commander.
I'm getting quite sick of people talking about the Tornado mission failure, and I've unfortunately heard a very brief clip from a retired United States Air Force general by the name of Perry, who said he was disappointed by the very poor performance of the Royal Air Force. That sort of language, I'm afraid, makes me as a commander in the field very disappointed that senior military officers should say things like that.
Criticism of the Tornado is bound to touch a nerve here. Men entrust their lives to these machines every night. But with the loss of 5 RAF Tornadoes so far, the issue is unlikely to go away. Mark Urban, BBC News, with the RAF in the Gulf.
On the Saudi border with Kuwait, Allied troops have been digging themselves in within sight of the Iraqi Army. One American commander said his men were well within range of Iraqi artillery, and they could see light glinting off the windscreens of Iraqi vehicles.
The Americans already have 250,000 men on the ground here. That's 4 times more than Iraq's elite Republican Guard. And today, the final wave of newly arrived United States armour has been moving north. These are M1A1 tanks, straight from NATO duties. They're the most fully equipped and sealed armoured vehicles in the world to cope with any of Saddam Hussein's biological or chemical warfare threat. The Allied forces have been buoyed by the capture of Iraqi prisoners of war and a small Kuwaiti island in the Gulf. For the Kuwaiti exiled armed forces, return to their homeland is a significant step nearer.
How long can the Iraqi armed forces in Kuwait resist?
When you get the Republican Guards, you won't find Iraqi army will stay in Kuwait because they don't want to stay in Kuwait. They are forced to stay in Kuwait.
General, do you give the liberation of Kuwait weeks or months?
I think it's not long. And many of the generals who I sat with, I heard it won't take long, I hope.
weeks or months?
It's not a time or a place to collect a date or weeks or months. It won't be long, and we will see that.
As this huge task force moves up ammunition and supplies nearer to Kuwait, everyone knows the order to advance won't come until the air war enfeebles the Republican Guard. Tonight, the latest debriefing of Iraqi deserters and prisoners of war from Kuwait shows some units are running short of supplies. The squeeze will dramatically intensify as Allied bombing concentrates on the occupied territory. Even so, the ground war could still be fierce. Brian Barron, BBC News, Eastern Saudi Arabia.
The Kuwaiti flag is flying again on the tiny island of Garu after its liberation by Allied forces. This amateur video, taken by a marine biologist in 1986, shows the island to be uninhabited apart from coast guards and some wildlife. It was also used for fishing, but recently it made a useful forward lookout position for the Iraqis. On the island are reminders of the Iran-Iraq war, including the fuel tank from a Phantom jet. There are reports from a Moscow news agency that Saddam Hussein has executed his top air force and defense commanders after suffering big losses in the war. The reports quote sources in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, which says it is keeping channels open with Iraq to try to find a peaceful settlement to the war. The Soviet Union has demanded Iraq should withdraw from Kuwait, but says it will not break its long-standing ties with Baghdad. From Moscow, Martin Sixsmith.
With the official media still expressing support for the American-led military effort, Soviet spokesmen have now begun to stress Moscow's continuing contacts with Baghdad in the search for a diplomatic solution.
We feel that, and we're hopeful that after the conflict is over, as soon as possible, and with a minimum number of casualties and destruction, hopefully, Iraq will rejoin the international community, and we would be able to continue our relations with that country.
Troops in the southern Soviet regions, less than 200 miles from Iraq, remain on high alert, a proximity which explains the Kremlin's desire to keep doors open to Baghdad, to enhance its position in the Middle East when the fighting is over. Before the war, Saddam Hussein received friendship and missiles from Moscow, and the Soviet military's sources in Baghdad are now producing tantalizing information from behind Iraqi lines. The news agency Interfax today reported a defense ministry source as saying that Saddam had executed his air force and air defense commanders following heavy Iraqi losses.
He gave rather interesting facts and figures, saying that 26 Scud anti-aircraft complexes were destroyed by the Allied forces, and out of 100, and 300 aircraft were destroyed out of 700 aircraft Iraq possesses.
And that was the reason why Saddam ordered these executions?
Exactly.
But the Iraqi embassy in Moscow called the report a lie. A spokesman who didn't wish to appear on camera told the BBC that the story was psychological warfare carried out by hostile forces. There's no independent confirmation of the Interfax claims, but the agency does have good contacts in the Soviet military establishment. And if the figures it gives for the destruction of Iraqi planes and missiles are anywhere near the truth, reports of Saddam's fury against his commanders may be credible. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
There's still no firm information on how many casualties have resulted from the Allied bombing raids on Iraq. The British and Americans continue to say they're targeting military installations and hope to keep loss of life to a minimum. The Iraqi government's own casualty figures are low, but there's no independent estimate.
Iraqi television has released pictures of Saddam Hussein meeting his generals. He's seen in a bunker or a caravan, it's not clear which, but it's intended to portray a leader firmly in control of his country, supported by a loyal population. The Allies would dearly like to know how true that is. It would be invaluable information in assessing the fighting ability of a large conscript army affected by civilian morale. But Baghdad has been reluctant to admit losses. A military communique last Saturday says 40 civilians were killed. Another on Wednesday listed 69 civilian dead in the past 2 days. But despite much talk of innocent blood spilt amid health centres and holy shrines, hard facts are hard to find.
But I've talked to Iraqis who told me that in some areas, especially near the
the so-called strategic targets, are having a very bad time because the planes come back every night to hit the same targets, apparently to cripple them completely, or I don't know why. And they told me that many people were killed, and I saw a woman crying, and they told me all of that area was affected near one of the airports.
But now almost all independent journalists have been ordered out. It's hard to check such reports. Today, the CNN correspondent was taken to a small town 100 miles north of Baghdad to be shown what officials said was the result of Allied bombing. He counted 23 homes destroyed and 24 new graves for the victims. Local people said there were no military installations nearby. He walked round part of the town and said, "It looked all civilian to me." It's the only time he's been allowed out of Baghdad. The Allies say they don't know Iraq's losses, but accept that inevitably some civilians will be among them.
The entire campaign has been conducted against the military infrastructure with the express directions that they should avoid causing any avoidable civilian casualties. So, having said that, I conclude that the civilian casualties, and of course there'll be some, are as low as you can possibly expect in a war of this magnitude.
Baghdad has concentrated on releasing pictures of life getting back to normal. There appears to be a tension between two propaganda aims, keeping up civilian morale on the one hand and appealing to international sympathy on the other. For the moment, it's trying to do both. But the few reports from other sources suggest a low level of civilian casualties and a catastrophic breakdown of everyday services.
We have reports of extreme chaos in Baghdad and the major cities which has been subjected to this relentless bombardment by the Allies. Lack of electricity supplies, water supplies and so on have created havoc, and people are becoming extremely living extremely difficult, in very difficult situations, and people are moving in their tens of thousands from Baghdad to seeking safe refuge in the Kurdish areas and so on.
Others are fleeing across the borders into Jordan, Iran and Turkey, and it's from the many stories that these refugees are telling that the best picture of what's going on inside Iraq will probably emerge.
Brian Hanrahan is with me now. Brian, as you said, details of civilian casualties are starting to filter out, but how much more difficult is it to uncover details of military casualties down on the front line itself?
Well, they're going to be a complete military secret because that gives away the willpower of the army to resist. But we are hearing from one of the other Kurdish groups, the Kurdish Democratic Party tonight, that they have heard of 10,000 casualties amongst the army, wounded and killed. And what they're saying is that the Iraqi authorities will not allow the bodies to be returned home for burial because that will undermine the civilian effort back home. We can't check that. We can't even know if it's true. But these are the sorts of reports, the scale of reports, which are beginning to filter out.
How successful do you judge the Iraqis to have been in forcing the Allies to deviate from their master plan for fighting the war?
Well, not at the moment very successful at all. It's as though there are two different wars going on here. One is the military war being fought by the Allies, which is following a classic military strategy to go in and destroy the enemy and force it to surrender. The other one is a political war being fought by Iraq, where they fire scuds, they let oil go, they might loose an Exocet, they might take an attack on Turkey, anything which could force the Allies to go in on the ground before they're ready, because that's where Iraq thinks that they have the best chance of winning. They're trying to dislodge the Allies from what they're doing.
And how are the Allies countering that?
Well, we've seen that all this week with this public relations exercise to say that the war will go on longer, to make sure that the civilian morale back in Britain and America doesn't go down, because what they want to say is that just because the war doesn't end next week doesn't mean we've lost it. That's the sort of message coming from Iraq. They're saying America, all this great power, has failed to destroy us in a week. They can't be any good. What the politicians here are saying, don't be taken in by that, and they're providing, as well as these warnings, a little bit of upbeat information. So there's enough there to keep the civilian morale in Britain and America, an important area, high.
Why do you think that the Allied commanders have been so insistent in recent days that we must expect some Iraqi successes? Why have they been hammering home that point?
Because in realistic terms, this war hasn't started on the Allied side. We have the losses to the Allied forces are minimal. They're pinpricks. I mean, on the other side, they're very bloody indeed. If there's going to be any ground fighting, it's going to be more than a handful of pilots lost. It could be hundreds, maybe thousands of people killed. And that is something they've got to prepare people for. That's not a big loss in wartime, but it would certainly be a devastating blow if it came out of the blue.
Briefly, Brian, the politicians are talking repeatedly of this being a long war. What do they mean by long? How long?
Historically, it's going to be a short war. I think what they're doing is creating room for the generals, so the generals are not stampeded by political problems. They're not saying it's going to be a long war. They're saying to the generals, do the military plan, don't feel political pressure to do it quickly.
Brian Hanahan, thanks very much indeed. The latest details.
Dozens of ambulances are now at the Scud destroyed part of an interior ministry building. There's still no official word on casualties, but it's almost certain at least one person has died and that there have been other injuries. It's only increased the hatred Saudi Arabians already feel towards Saddam Hussein, especially those who witnessed this explosion.
Okay, he accuses the joint forces that they are hitting civilian targets when he is aiming with no cautious to the civilians in the Saudi cities.
What do you think of Saddam Hussein?
I think he's a lunatic.
An investigation is already underway into why Riyadh's elaborate and expensive Patriot missile defences finally failed tonight. Ben Brown, BBC News, Riyadh.
And tonight's other main news, there have been more Scud missile attacks on Israel. The 5th missile attack on Tel Aviv killed 1 person and injured 40 others. A huge oil spill is threatening the Gulf. America says Iraq is deliberately pumping millions of barrels of oil into the sea. The Pentagon calls it environmental terrorism. Lieutenant General Sir Peter de la Billière said the Allies are winning the war. Low-level flying raids are suspended as new air tactics are adopted. There'll be more on Newsnight on BBC Two at 10:30. The next scheduled news is here on this channel at 1:10. But of course, if there are any major developments in the Gulf War, we'll bring them to you right away. That is the 9 o'clock news tonight. Good night.
7 Iraqi warplanes have fled to Iran. The Iranians say they've been seized and will be held until the end of the war. The oil slick in the Gulf is now 30 miles long, part of it said to be a light. And British expatriates rush to leave as the Scud gets through to Saudi cities. Good evening. 7 Iraqi jets have made emergency landings in northern Iran. One of them burst into flames and 2 others were damaged. Iraq has asked for the planes and the pilots back, but Iran says any aircraft landing in its territory will be seized and held until the end of the war. A short while ago, the Americans said they'd shot down 3 more Iraqi MiG-23 fighters.
It's not clear why the warplanes landed in Iran. Iraq says they were forced down. Iran says they asked to make emergency landings. When permission was granted, it says they were escorted in by Iranian fighters. A Tehran radio report monitored by the BBC said that one of the Iraqi jets exploded when it landed and that 2 others were damaged. The incident seems to have embarrassed the Iranian government. Reports from Tehran keep stressing their official neutrality. The latest said that aircraft from either side would be seized if they landed in Iran. President Rafsanjani has resisted pressure from Muslim radicals in Tehran to join a holy war against America and its allies. He said it would be suicide for Iran to get involved with Iraq, but he's also demanded the withdrawal of all foreign forces from the Gulf. There have been unconfirmed reports that Saddam Hussein had his Air Force commanders shot after their poor showing in the first week of the war. If that's true, a crisis of morale in the Air Force might have encouraged the pilots who landed in Iran to defect. Another possibility is that the Iraqi fighters accidentally strayed into Iranian airspace, or they could have been escaping an attack by Allied aircraft. Thousands of refugees have been crossing the border into Iran as well. The Iranians will try to make sure that none of today's arrivals compromise their neutrality.
The Americans are trying to find out why Scud missiles are getting through the Patriot defense shield. At a briefing in the Saudi Arabian capital Riyadh, they said the Allies' bombing raids had totally destroyed Iraq's nuclear capability.
This mound of rubble is all that's left of a 6-story office building which was completely destroyed by last night's Scud on Riyadh. 1 man was killed, 30 other people were injured, and an investigation's now underway into why Patriot missiles failed to intercept the Scud's warhead in time. Saddam Hussein may be celebrating his success here, but today the Allies said they've again been hitting his forces hard.
Earlier today, United States Air Force F-15s have shot down 3 Iraqi MiGs. In subsequent reports, it's believed that the aircraft are MiG-23s and that they've gone down over Iraq.
And the Americans announced that for the first time ever in combat, they fired a cruise missile from one of their submarines.
The missile was launched from the Louisville while she was submerged in the Red Sea. The missile was launched against an unidentified Iraqi target. This announcement is made to document a significant event in naval history.
And ferocious attacks on Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard appear to be continuing. After one bombing raid on their positions, an American pilot reported seeing an enormous fireball from 200 miles away. Ben Brown, BBC News, Riyadh in Saudi Arabia.
The United States says that the oil slick in the Gulf is now 30 miles long by 8 miles wide. America says the Iraqis released the oil from tankers and Kuwaiti storage tanks. Baghdad says it's from 2 Iraqi tankers bombed by the Americans. The slick near an oil terminal at Al Ahmadi is said to be drifting south.
The oil is still slurping ashore today along the tense Gulf Coast where occupied Kuwait runs into eastern Saudi Arabia. Whoever is to blame, the impact of the disaster on the Arabian environment is all too plain. Along this stretch of beach, cormorants by the score are dead or dying. The crude oil saturates their feathers. There's no one to attempt even a token effort at containing the oil slick here or saving the wildlife. Overhead is the ceaseless roar of Allied bombers heading for Kuwait and Baghdad. Whatever the final extent of this pollution, Allied military sources stressed again today it won't impede action to liberate Kuwait. This crude oil is too thick to set on fire easily. It has begun to sink beneath the surface already, so shouldn't inhibit any American amphibious operation. The oil has come ashore at the abandoned border town of Kafji. All 45,000 Saudi residents were evacuated when the Iraqi Army shelled it. Kafji's desalination plant to make water from the sea stands idle. The workers have fled, and the oil slick would block the plant's filters. The shadow of Saddam Hussein has entered this town.
This is by far the worst that the world has seen as far as an oil spill is concerned. This is an order of magnitude greater than any tanker accident that we've seen before. The immediate effects are damage to shoreline and damage to marine life. And as the oil slick comes on further south, there may be impact to the water desalination plants that are up and down the coast here.
Emergency plans are being drawn up to protect this huge desalination plant on the Gulf Coast. It supplies the capital, Riyadh, 300 miles away. Kuwait's exile government says Saddam Hussein's action is calculated.
This is very much expected from a regime that has never given any value to life. This has been their practice during the Iraqi Army war, and this practice again, as we've seen, is resumed. And they think that by doing this, they can actually, I believe, would not leave any life behind.
Tonight, the whole of the Gulf is waiting apprehensively. In the ancient fishing communities, a way of life is going to be eclipsed by a deliberate act of war. It is Saddam Hussein's message to the Gulf sheikdoms who thought they were out of his reach. Brian Barron, BBC News, Eastern Saudi Arabia.